Welcome to Talking Points. My name is Dr. Stephen E. Gardner, and we have been discussing a fabulous series on core values for faith and community leaders. And we have looked at numerous leadership theories up to this point. And we want to continue that discussion about leadership from a theoretical side and also a practical side. The last time we were together, we looked at transformational leadership, and we looked at how that relates not only in the secular world, but it's also one of those theories that fits well with those who pastor churches, who head up nonprofits, and that's good. You probably also have learned that throughout this series that there are a number of similarities between how one scholar looks at leadership and how another scholar looks at leadership. We probably also saw some diverse similarities or diverse differences as well. And today we want to talk about a brand new approach to leadership. And it's referred to as servant leadership. Now, you probably, if you were part of the faith community, you probably heard that term mentioned in maybe one of your leadership meetings or one of your conventions, or just heard the term in general or picked up a book or whatever the case it might be, and they talk about servant leadership. And at some point we're going to discuss servant leadership in the church. But before we do that, what we're going to talk about is where the term was coined. We're going to look at the historical background about servant leadership. We're going to look at a few of the features and characteristics of servant leadership, so we can better posit an understanding that will not only will I better understand it, but also I'll be better able and better equipped on how to draw from this kind of approach to improve my leadership position, whether I'm in the church or whether I'm in the community, in the public sector, or just your job. It's important to understand servant leadership. Let's go right into this and let's see what we have in our presentation. So today we're going to be talking about servant leadership part 1. The question that must be asked, what is servant leadership? And one of the things that comes to mind when we think about servant leadership is that it's a paradox. Servant leadership is an approach that runs counter to common sense. Why? Because our everyday images of leadership do not coincide with leaders being servants. Why? Because leaders are expected to be an influence and servants are expected to follow. So, how can leadership be both servant and influence? And how can a person be a leader and at the same time be a servant? Although servant leadership seems contradictory and challenges our traditional beliefs about leadership, but let me tell you, it is one of those approaches that offers a unique perspective on how to see those that you lead and how to lead from a position as a servant. Ross, in his book on leadership, he mentions this. He states, servant leadership puts the leader in the role of the servant who utilizes caring principles to focus on followers' needs, to help those followers become more autonomous, knowledgeable, and like servants themselves. So you can see that servant leadership and transformational leadership have some similarities because they focus on followers' needs. And specific to servant leadership, this approach moves toward making or trying to enable an individual to become autonomous, knowledgeable, and like servants themselves. So the servant leader wants to produce after his own kind. I'm a servant leader, so I want to produce other servant-like leaders as well. When we begin to look at a definition of servant leadership, it is best to look at the one that's been most used in this arena of leadership. And so this is taken from R.K. Greenleaf. And he states this about servant leadership, and I think it's worth repeating. Servant leadership begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first. Then conscious choice brings one to aspire to lead. The difference manifests itself in the care taken by the servant. First, to make sure that other people's highest priority, or should I say, highest priority needs, are being served. Now, the best test, he states, is, do those served grow as persons? Do they, while being served, become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, more likely themselves become servants? And what is the effect on the least privileged of society? Will they benefit? Or at least, will they not be further deprived? So now, the way Greenleaf introduces the concept of servant leadership, he not only talks about it from the role of the leader being the servant, but he also talks about, his intent to make the followers healthier, wiser, and more autonomous, and that is the measurement. But he also talks about a type of awareness and a type of desire that's resident in the mind of the servant leader. And that is, they have a unique focus on the least privileged in society. And they want to know whether or not their style of leadership is going to benefit them. Or at least, will they not be further deprived? In other words, it kind of mirrors what Jesus talked about in Scripture when he said to others that we need to be concerned about the least of these. So if you are a servant leader, do you care about the underserved? Do you care about the marginalized? Do you care about the least of these? That is one of the manifestations, that is one of the practices, that is one of the characteristics and attributes of a servant leader. That while they are leading in their respective roles as a servant leader, they do not disregard those who find themselves in a position or being labeled as the least of these. And so I think that's unique, because we need to think about that today as we begin to talk about servant leadership and begin to look and see, is it really functioning in our society? Or have those who've talked to us about servant leadership have regarded this aspect that the original author of it considered to be important, that is, the least of these? Well, I've already kind of alluded toward Robert Greenleaf. And so when we look at the historical background of servant leadership, this gentleman, Dr. Greenleaf, has wrote many works on the subject. In fact, the majority of those who discuss servant leadership today regard his works as being seminal works. In other words, the original work that is actually used to talk about the subject of servant leadership. And this individual, Dr. Greenleaf, has significantly influenced how servant leadership has developed on the practical and theoretical level. And let me say this again, that in all that we've learned about leadership, we've also found that there's a theory and there's a practice that go hand in hand. And sometimes to better understand how things should be practiced, we have to look at the theory. Well, Dr. Greenleaf influenced how servant leadership would be developed on the practical and also on the theoretical level. And what he did originally in 1964, he founded the Center for Applied Ethics. Now it's called the Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership. And last I heard, it is located somewhere in Westfield, Indiana. Greenleaf stated that a servant leader has social responsibility. That is, social responsibility to be concerned about the have-nots and those less privileged. If inequities and social injustice exist, a servant leader tries to remove them. So again, this was mentioned by Graham, who reflected back upon Greenleaf's work and Greenleaf's contributions. And what he said there, that the main thing that's highlighted here about servant leadership, that the servant leader has social responsibility. So if I'm social responsible as a servant leader, then I am exhibiting the kind of characteristics that this particular style and this particular approach values. More of the background states that in becoming a servant leader, a leader uses less institutional power and control while shifting authority to those that are being led. So here the servant leader is in this position of power. They're in this power because they either were promoted in it or they aspired to this particular level. But now, as a servant leader, they use less of this institutional power and control while shifting that authority to those who are being led. So in other words, they involve followers in this whole process of achieving, as we've learned, the common good of the organization. Servant leadership values community because it provides a face-to-face opportunity for individuals to experience interdependence, respect, trust, and individual growth. So when we think about interdependence, we think about two other words that come along with that. One is dependence and the other is independence. Well, interdependence is that a style by which what I have to offer and what you have to offer coexist. They need each other. And it's you kind of see each other from the position of an egalitarian. And so when we talk about servant leadership in the Bible or servant leadership in the church, we're going to look at some examples, especially how Jesus viewed how he led his disciples and how he viewed his followers who followed him. When we think about servant leadership, obviously it does raise a level of respect and trust and individual growth, because all of these things are important in the concept of servant leadership. Do the followers respect you? And do you as the leader respect those who follow? Do you trust them? And obviously, do they trust you? Am I inspiring individuals to grow personally and professionally? All of these things are associated with the approach called servant leadership. Well, now, Spears, in one of the things that he mentioned in 2002, he described that there were 10 characteristics of servant leadership. And I'm going to talk about a few of those today. The first one is called listening. Communication between leaders and followers is an interactive process that includes sending and receiving messages, that is, talking and listening. And you that have been in leadership for a while, or you that are in counseling, understand the term called active listening. And so one of the things that a servant leader exhibits is that they listen. They listen to what's being said. They listen to ideas. They listen to the followers. That's very similar to transformational leadership, because the transformational leader also listens. Servant leaders communicate, watch this, by listening first. That is how they're communicating, by listening first. A while back when we talked about the ministry of presence, it is when you're there beside a person, you're really not saying anything, but you're there present for them. And the fact that you're present for them, not talking, your presence is speaking. And so a servant leader, the way he communicates, rather than by talking, they listen first. They recognize that listening is a learned discipline that involves hearing and being receptive to what others have to say. Through listening, servant leaders acknowledge the viewpoint of others and validate their perspectives. The second characteristic that he mentions that we've seen in other leadership theories that we've discussed is empathy. And empathy is, quote unquote, standing in the shoes of another person and attempting to see the world from that person's point of view. Standing in the shoes of another person. And so what that means is that whatever lens that I have to take that lens off and put on the lens of the other person and try to see things from how they see it and try to empathize with what they are experiencing and try to feel what they're feeling. That's empathy. And an empathetic servant leader, they demonstrate that they truly understand what followers are thinking and feeling. So they are intuitive. They practice and they learn to really pay attention to what others are thinking and what others are feeling. So when a servant leader shows empathy, it is confirming and validating for the follower. It makes the follower feel unique. In other words, when you have someone that really cares about your station in life, really cares about what you're going through and what is your story, what has brought you to this particular place, and they're just not concerned about, here's a job, I want you to get it done, but they're concerned about what's on your heart. What are your needs? What are your aspirations? Let me just spend some time here and just listen to what you have to say. That type of servant leader makes the follower feel special and feel unique. The third thing that Spears brought to the table about servant leadership is the characteristic of healing. And to heal means to make whole. Servant leaders care about the personal well-being of followers. To heal makes whole. So they support followers by helping them to overcome personal problems. Well, to do that, you got to take an interest in the problems of the people that you're leading. It's not just about the bottom line. It's not just about, your agenda. It's not just about, even the organizational goals. Because in an organization, you're going to have people that are on the front line doing the work, but you're going to have people that are managing the work, and you're going to have people that are overseeing the work. So the managers and the overseers, when we think about servant leadership, they take special interest to receive input and to really think about the personal problems of those who are within their organization. They also tend to support followers by helping them overcome those personal problems. We've already stated that. And Greenleaf argues that the price of healing is a two-way street. In helping followers become whole, guess what? The servant leader themselves are made whole. In other words, they're healed while they're in the process of healing somebody else. The next characteristic of servant leadership is called awareness. And for Greenleaf, awareness is a quality within the servant leader that makes them acutely attuned and receptive to their physical, social, and political environments. In other words, he knows what's going on around him. He knows the politics, he knows the social conditions, and he knows the physical environment as well. It includes understanding oneself and the impact one has on the other. So in other words, a servant leader, not only are they attuned to the conditions that we've already mentioned, but they also know something about themselves and they're aware of the impact that they have on other people. That's awareness. With awareness, servant leaders are able to step aside and view themselves and their own perspectives in the greater context of the situation. They're able to step aside and view themselves and their perspectives in the greater context of the situation. I think that's important because sometimes we do need to step aside. Because sometimes as leaders, we can become so blinded by our own vision. We can become so blinded by the things that we're trying to accomplish, and we want others to kind of help us do those things. But I'm thinking about more so about what is meaningful to me rather than what's meaningful to the context. How can I be a better part of this context? And I think that when we begin to think about that as a servant leader, we're moving toward not only actualizing ourselves, but also actualizing our followers. The next characteristic of servant leadership is persuasion. And obviously persuasion is clear and persistent communication that convinces others to change. Well, someone said, if you want others to change, be the change you want in others. So I think as a servant leader, the first way to be influential in the change of followers is, first of all, be the change. Be that example of what it should look like. So to communicate clearly and persistently, the servant leader uses those dynamics, as it were, to convince others to change. And I'm saying, first of all, they are modeling and exhibiting what that change should look like. Persuasion, rather, is opposed to coercion. And coercion is where you're really trying to twist someone's arm to do what you want to be done. In servant leadership, it utilizes a positional authority, rather than utilizing positional authority to force compliance. Persuasion creates change, watch this, through the use of non-judgmental argument. So you don't try to make people feel bad. You don't try to argue your point of view, but you create change through the use of non-judgmental argument. You don't belittle people. You don't make them feel small, but you find a way by which that you can persuade them rather than try to coerce them. Well, we've talked about servant leadership part 1 today. And here on this last slide are a few references that I've drawn from to try to give a picture as to what servant leadership is about. In our next segment, our next time we're together, we're going to talk about servant leadership part 2. And in Servant Leadership Part 2, we're going to look at some examples from the Bible as how we as people of faith have envisioned servant leadership. And maybe we might look at some other examples that are in nonprofit or in the public sector as to how servant leadership works. So you come back next week and tune in to Talking Points. I trust you've been blessed, and we look forward to seeing you again real soon.